Now, the war in Ukraine is sending economic ripple effects around the world. Here at home, we're watching closely how wheat prices are rising since both Russia and Ukraine were large exporters. Sunflower oil prices have also risen sharply too, and some retailers are limiting the purchases of consumers. But are the price hikes justified and only linked to the war? The Competition Commission says it's taking a closer look. To discuss, we're joined by the Competition Commission's Chief Economist, James Hodge. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Hodge. So a 5-litre bottle of cooking oil costs around 177 Rand. That's apparently 40 Rand more expensive than it was in December. It's gone up by 42% over a year, I understand. So let's start by establishing these are unusual increases and very significant.
They're extremely significant, and one forgets that for a household, especially amongst your poorer households, this is probably 3-5% of your food budget for the month. So 40% is a very unusual number, and we're aware that there were some market factors affecting the price late last year, but obviously the war in Ukraine has had a big effect on that now.
So you want to check, do you not, that the retailers aren't using the war, though, as a reason for unjustifiable price hikes?
Yes, and not just the retailers, but also your edible oil companies. So the ones that process that in South Africa or abroad. So what our experience has tended to be in the past through this pandemic is that companies may use the cover of some of the cost increases to put prices up much higher than they should and just earn excessive profits, including just earning big sort of Rand margins on the profits. And everyone in the chain does that. So we are looking into this more closely, and if we find that companies are profiteering from consumers at this time, then we will act.
Well, if it is happening, it means that nobody's learned from all the controversies around the masks and COVID-19 goods that led to investigations in the past.
Yeah, I think plenty companies are more cautious. But, you know, this also involves food companies, involves manufacturers of oil. And what we've tended to see, you know, in the past is that a price increase that maybe should affect them a few months down the line because they have stocks bought at a cheaper price, that they start to push those price increases through much earlier. We hope they've learned, certainly we do, and that these are justified by costs. But we need to examine that. And you mentioned wheat earlier. That's another one we have to keep on our radar because India just announced an export ban on wheat as well. So there's probably going to be disruptions to that market. But even as we saw with fuel, sometimes those can calm down, and the initial uncertainty gives way to lower prices. And we also want to make sure that when that happens, that prices are reduced here and they aren't maintained at a high level.
When do you get involved? Let's just clarify, because people are allowed to make profits. That's what companies do in a capitalist economy. And the idea is that people would compete. And if there's enough competition, then the prices would come down because they'd all offer specials or things like that. When do you look at it and say this is unfair or unlawful?
Well, we do have a concentrated grocery industry, and we also have a concentrated edible oils industry in this country. So we can't always rely on competition to bring the market into line. We only get involved if it's an unjust increase. We completely understand if your costs go up, you may need to increase the price. It's whether those two are proportionate or not. So if you put the price up much more than your costs have increased, that's when we would start and act. And we have seen, as I said, during this pandemic, that companies have a little more market power than they do usually. So we can't in this country always presume competition will fix things.
All right, and you said you're looking at wheat as well. What about other things? There's a huge concern around fuel and diesel. Of course, fuel is regulated, but diesel is not. Any other concerns? And according to the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group, a whole lot of things have gone up. Polony, apples, chicken and beef liver, all up by more than 20% in a year.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of food products that are getting impacted by climate change and uncertainty. What we're trying to do is narrow down the list to those where we're seeing bigger than expected increases in a general inflation environment. You must remember that petrol and diesel affects all production because it's logistics and will affect agriculture as well. So whilst all products may have that general inflation environment, it's where we see unusually high movements. So basically, we have set up a monitoring unit that we've been operating for 2 years now that tracks the price increases, also looks at wholesale prices. And when we see those two diverging, so retail prices moving more than wholesale, that's when we can initiate. And what we would do as a first step is really to initiate a complaint, investigate it further, just to see whether our concerns are justified or not. If they're not, then the complaint is closed and it's non-referred. If they are justified, we'll move to correct that.
Out of interest, do you look at the initial profit margins? I mean, if you're making a killing on every item, you can absorb the price hikes that come and still look good. But maybe initially you start off with a huge margin. Do you look at things like that, or only track how goods increase over time?
Look, strictly, we'll look at whether the margin is increasing, but that is not always the case. And I think you raised an important point. So take, for instance, in our big second wave, we had the price of ginger and garlic go up considerably. And what we found was, typically that cost the retailers about 40 Rand, and they were adding, a 30-40% margin because the thing didn't move that rapidly. But when it's costing 200 Rand and you add 30 to 40%, suddenly that is over 100 Rand margin, not 10, 15 Rand margin. And we look at that as well, because in that case, we did pull the retailers into line and said, you can't justify earning over 100 Rand on a kilogram of garlic. So the same with cooking oil. We will look at absolute margin and not just percentage margin. And if retailers are adding 50, 60 Rand themselves onto the cost price, then we think there's still something to be answered for.
All right, thank you very much. We'll follow that. The Competition Commission is saying right now it's just looking into prices of edible oil, sunflower oil, things like that. That was a Competition Commission Chief Economist, James Hodge.